Hello and welcome to today's webinar, hosted by Jordan Lawrence and X1 Discovery. My name is Catherine Goodman, and I'll be your operator for this event. Before we begin, here are some brief housekeeping items. For best sound quality, we recommend using the telephone option instead of your computer's microphone and speakers. To do so, you'll need to first select the telephone radio button located in the audio section of your control panel. When you select telephone, a dial-in number will appear, along with an access code and an audio pin. The audio pin is necessary to participate in the live Q&A. All phone lines have been muted and will remain muted until the question and answer period towards the end of this event. You may type a question in the chat window at the bottom of your control panel, or you may raise your hand to ask a question by clicking on the yellow colored hand in your control panel. But we will hold all responses from our speakers until the Q&A. Lastly, the recording of today's webinar, along with a PDF of the slides, will be emailed to all attendees within 5 business days. Thank you for attending, and now let's introduce our speakers. Ron Pertowski, principal at Pertowski Law Firm and former senior counsel at Halliburton, has a wealth of expertise in designing and implementing business processes around mitigation of legal risk for corporations, including legal risk identification and management, contract and records management, e-discovery, litigation management, and associated processes. Marty Proven is Executive Vice President of Jordan Lawrence, a leading solution provider for records retention, data privacy, and information governance. He has over 20 years of experience in information technology and governance. Marty joined Jordan Lawrence in 2003 and advises an in-house counsel, compliance, and privacy professionals in the areas of records management, data privacy, and e-discovery, and the confluence of technology in these areas. John Patsakis, President and CEO at X1 Discovery, is also an attorney and a software executive, former Guidance Software CEO and co-founder, with extensive background in e-discovery and corporate investigations, combining strong knowledge of both the law and the supporting technologies. John Barron, VP of Enterprise Sales at X1 Discovery, leads X1 Discovery's enterprise sales and business development initiatives. With over 20 years in sales leadership roles, including 13 years at FileNet IBM, John brings extensive experience with enterprise search, content, and records management and e-discovery. Welcome, gentlemen, and thank you for joining us today. John Patsakis, it's all yours.
Thank you, Catherine. And thank you and welcome to the over 100 participants in our webinar today. We have a great agenda, some great speakers with Ron Pertowski and Marty Brown. And so I want to thank them and Jordan Lawrence for co-sponsoring. For today's agenda, we're going to discuss legal and business concerns due to over-retention and the issues that arise there. Ron is going to have some great insight into some relevant case law as well as best practices. One also overarching theme is that we're going to discuss a bit the difference between what is a record and what is relevant electronically stored information, because the two do converge, but they're also very different. And as an example, with the record, a business record should be able to be defined at the point of its creation, especially if there are good established processes that define their creation. And conversely, electronically stored information, what is relevant ESI, is something that really cannot be determined in most cases until the lawsuit actually materializes. And I think that one of the compelling things we're going to discuss today is being able to develop and design a process that really accounts for these differences to address both, yet also be able to handle the differing categorizations. And to that point, we're going to discuss effective and defensive retention schedules and policies that help address this in a very defensible manner. And then finally, best practice technology, followed by Q&A. So now I'd like to introduce an attorney who's been practicing e-discovery law and records retention for at least 15 years, way back in the early days Ron Perkowski.
Thank you, John. I'm pretty goes back to like the days before electricity, actually, when we didn't have electronics, much less electronic discovery. But I'd just like to say I'm really very honored to be here today. It's an unbelievable panel. And I'm going to be sort of pitching my legal test, if you will, for those of you that are trained in law school at two levels. In the first level, which is kind of the simple one, I'm really just going to lay out what it is that I think the law supports in terms of what you have to do to preserve evidence, what that common law duty that Judge Shinlin referred to in her famous opinion might actually encompass, because I'm not as aware of the obviousness of such a duty as she is, or the scope of it. And then secondly, I think those of you, and there are many on this call who will fall into this category, will see there's a much more sophisticated argument going on, sort of rebutting a lot of the notions of what has to take place in light of the imperatives of different kinds of consulting firms. But today's question is really, when can one really remediate legacy data? And the answer to that is you can remediate legacy data, which basically means dispose of it, when there's no duty to preserve it. And in today's world, a duty to preserve might fall into two categories. One is if you have a records retention program in place that you've documented that requires you to retain records, either because there's a regulatory obligation, such as the IRS, to keep it, or perhaps because it's evidence in a litigation. And then when there is litigation, you have a duty to comply with whatever the rules are around that particular piece of litigation. And that's, as I think John will talk about more, that's where everyone gets all confused, because the same kinds of words mean vastly different things when you have litigation going on than before. And really, the example that I want to use here at a very basic level is there's a difference between a duty to keep something and a duty not to throw it away. And if there's a burning building, you don't have a duty to go rush into that burning building to retrieve your electronically stored information, or indeed your paper information. But you also have a duty not to take all of your evidence that would otherwise be incriminating and throw it into the fire. So people have to sort of keep that in mind when they start talking about what a duty is and how these different duties play out. But the one thing that is clear to me is that you can throw anything you want away as long as you have a copy of it somewhere else. The only difference to that would be if you were in some sort of highly intense, forensically correct environment, such as an FCPA investigation, where the U.S. government specifically wants to make sure that you haven't deleted or altered any metadata. And then you're just in a whole different kettle of fish that is far beyond the scope of today's presentation. So with that, we can go to the next slide. So the question then becomes, in the normal course of business, absent a federal subpoena, for example, what is an appropriate duty to preserve, and what are the limits of that duty? When does it arise, and what's covered? As we talked about before, you can't throw the stuff into the fire. You can't dispose of materials that are subject to production. And also, people would say that you cannot dispose of potential evidence when litigation can be reasonably anticipated. So I want to talk about that notion for a second in the context of records management. A record, almost by definition, is something that evidences a transaction. And when we put Halliburton's records retention policy in place, that's how we define record. Record was something that evidences a transaction. And in that term, evidence means something far different than evidence in litigation. It's just proof that something happened in a way that you could potentially use in a court of law. And people want to keep records. You want to keep your records. The biggest problem that we tended to have at Halliburton, and I believe this is true of most of my colleagues in-house, is when you have a litigation, it's finding all the evidence that you want to prove the underlying transaction. Finding the contract, finding the signed contract, finding the contract that you want to stand on, finding the contract that you want to show the internal auditors for when they come in to check Sarbanes-Oxley. And so there are a number of consultants out there. Jordan Lawrence is obviously one of the leaders, who will give you a basic taxonomy for a structured data set in which you are going to store all the records that are going to evidence the transactions that you need to have evidence for all the different purposes that you might want to evidence a transaction, whether it's accounting the auditors, pleasing your shareholders, or figuring out what it was that you did. Everything else can be thrown away. I want to talk just briefly about the Rule 37F safe harbor in the context of this. There's this notion that arose back in 2000, let's say, that there was a problem because systems like SAP or even some of the earlier mainframe systems basically generate records on the fly. If you go in there and you ask SAP, how much did Marty Proven get paid by Jordan Lawrence, SAP is going to go out there and it's going to run a search based upon its current database. So if Marty has moved and he's asking for W-2s because he needs to send them to the people who are funding his new home mortgage, that W-2 in many cases will show his current address as being his address all the way back to birth, because they generate them on the fly. And so the 37F safe harbor, we're trying to deal with the fact that in the ordinary course, a lot of these information systems routinely erase data you might otherwise have, but it is not in any sense of the imagination intended to create a bar to which you must aspire. It's not an aspirational standard. But that is the only case in which you are allowed to dispose of information. You can dispose of information anytime you want, as long as you don't need it for something else, such as your records management policy, or as long as you don't need it because of litigation. So the real problem that emerges for most of us is, what do we do with the huge pile of unstructured data that's out there, which is typically email? Now, as we move forward into the 21st century here, we're finding that there's less and less email, but it's harder and harder to get rid of what we do get because it's not worth the time. I don't know about the other people on this call, but I've noticed that I'm very heavy into email, and my son, who's 16, doesn't even know what his email account is. He lives on text messages. So there's different forms of electronic unstructured data that are outside of the information that's maintained in a records management system. And if there is litigation, you need to save it. And the different duties, the different sources of your duty to arise are pretty much articulated in the Federal Rules of Civil Procedure and the Federal Rules of Evidence. But note that there is a massive change. There's a massive paradigm shift once that litigation is filed. And just a very quick example of the difference in thinking is this. When I create a patent right now for my company, I'm going to want to keep evidence around my creation of that patent and the fact that I created it independently in the event that there's a lawsuit. By the same token, when the lawsuit comes in, people are going to ask for all kinds of data around the creation of that patent that may or may not exist. My ability to get rid of that data at the time that the lawsuit is filed is going to change radically. And we can talk later if we want about when do we know that a lawsuit's going to be filed. But the point that I just want to emphasize here is there's a rapid change in the scope of what you must protect once a lawsuit is filed. And here on this slide, I really want to flag people what I think is a very insightful comment by the advisory committee on the notice of Rule 4.1. These are the Federal Rules of Evidence. The fact of the matter is, something becomes relevant if it has a tendency to make a fact more or less probable than it would be without the evidence. Any good lawyer, and all the plaintiff's lawyers out there are really good, are going to be able to come up with some sort of argument as to why every single email in your file is potentially relevant. So there needs to be some other standard beyond the fact that the plaintiff's lawyers have asked for it. Otherwise, it leads to what really has become true of ESI. You get this Y2K type hysteria where you can't possibly throw away anything or there'll be a sanction imposed against you. So we can go to the next slide. Okay, so Rule 37F, as we talked about before, poses a little bit of a safe harbor, which says you can throw it away in the normal course of business. In the FTC case, which is one of the few that have actually been decided, that's been found to be okay. So at a very, very high level, we know that if we keep everything and don't throw away anything, we're going to be fine as long as it just gets disposed of in the normal course, as long as we've issued a document of litigation hold when the litigation comes in. Next slide. Please. So what it boils down to for me is this in terms of what you have in terms of the duty to preserve. You should have an ongoing documented records retention program, because that way you will pick up all of the evidence of the transaction, whether it's a contract or a patent creation or the like, at the time that you've done it. And in setting up those business rules and guidelines, you'll be acting independently of any thought of litigation. You'll just simply be doing it in the normal course of business, and that's very defensible. When you do get litigation, when the world shifts in that sort of dramatic way, and you're now afraid of throwing things away, then you issue a documented litigation hold to your custodians. My recommendation is always that you have to do it as soon as you hire counsel. If you hire me, you better have a litigation hold issued. It's going to be the first thing that I do as counsel if you don't have one, and it should be documented, because why even risk the argument? There's really never a reason not to issue a litigation hold. Then you're going to want to search and gather the files of your identified custodian, just like we did back before electricity. You go to the mall, you say, give us copies of your documents, you put them all in a cardboard box. You get all of your known sources with documented search terms, and you go out there and you search for it in the ESI world. That's where all the trouble historically has come in, and that's really where I think X1 now has, why I joined their advisory board, has really created a breakthrough technology. Because just as we could do that with paper, now you can do it electronically. You can go out there, install a system, sweep all the custodian records with document search terms, have the custodians give it to you, and keep it without it being a major process, without it being a major emotional event. Then you've got copies of everything you need to have, and you can go ahead and destroy everything else. You know where that evidence resides, you can back it up. As time goes on, you can expand it or narrow it after you have your conferences and your iterative discovery. Again, it's a very useful ad hoc tool. So the combination of a good records retention program with built-in rules and the ability to go out and support a litigation hold by saving copies of stuff, to me, provides a defensible control strategy that would allow you to remediate your legacy data and throw everything else away. With that, I will hand it back to John.
Thank you, Ron. Excellent presentation. And keep in mind that Ron will be available at the end for Q&A. So now let me turn it over to Jordan Lawrence, EVP, Marty Provin.
Thank you, John, and thank you, Ron, and thank you, everyone, for attending to today's call. So let me lay out the basic problem, and that is every organization out there has way too much information, too much ESI. They're buried in it. These aren't my numbers. Look at the statistics that are out there. Data consumption storage is growing at a rate of 25% plus, according to Gartner, in companies in the U.S. Today, 60% of litigation costs go towards document review. Ron brought up an excellent point, and that is the fact that any good plaintiff's lawyer will be able to argue that all the emails, all the ESI is relevant to some degree. So when we thought about putting this program together, one of the things that I was a strong advocate for, and I think my co-panelists agree, is that truly the holy grail is that prior to the onset of investigation litigation, if organizations could remediate and get rid of the information that they don't need, that is the holy grail. That's the game changer. So why hasn't it happened up till now? Well, the problem is simply this, is that there's never, ever been an effective way to separate the wheat from the chaff, so to speak. So in other words, Ron is also correct that businesses are obligated to maintain records. There are evidence of transaction. There's other definitions out there, but essentially it comes down to this: is that businesses have certain statutory requirements that compel them to retain certain records, and they have business conditions that they need to retain certain records. The challenge has been, though, is that organizations seldom have any confidence in the fact that they've accounted for their records. Thus, they must keep all the information they create. And what we've got up here is some data. I think this is very interesting. This is some data that Microsoft submitted to the Discovery Subcommittee of the Advisory Committee on the Civil Rules. And in essence, I'll boil it down to you. What Microsoft said is that, essentially, they have to handle or keep 340,000 pages of information. They preserve that for every one page that's actually used in litigation. Now, Microsoft is a huge organization, but I'll tell you, doing this for as long as I have, that statistically, these numbers ring true proportionally to any size business. It's massive amounts of information that has to be handled and touched to get to what's really relevant. So if you turn to the next slide, please. So what a business needs, what organizations desperately need, is a process that really can work, a practical process to be able to address ESI before the onset of litigation investigation, as well as then to be in a much better posture when that happens. So I'm going to walk you through a process that we've developed over the last, 25 years. It's a process that works. It works quite effectively. This is a process that, obviously we work with clients on, but it's not a process that we've got the monopoly on by any means. So let's start at the very beginning, and that is to effectively address ESI and remediate it. The very first thing I have to truly understand as a business is, what are my records? And it is rare. I'll tell you, it's rare that we go into any organization that truly has a grasp on and a definition, a taxonomy of what their records are that's universally understood across the enterprise, both from the legal suite to the IT to the business side. So step one is we have to define what are our records. We then have to understand where are our records, both in terms of how they associate to the organizational structure, but we also have to understand the media, the applications that our records are in. If you think about it, records are terribly redundant. Whatever you have in HR, you're likely to have redundant versions of that in other areas of the organization, in the accounting, administrative, payroll section, perhaps in the legal suite, in internal audit. So I have to understand where this information is. I have to understand the processes that my business people use to manage and work with this information on a day in and day out basis. I know Ron brought up an excellent point too. I never really thought about his 16-year-old son using texting, and not really being as wed to email as that I am, certainly. But where's the information today? Is it in the cloud? Is it on file shares? Is it on my laptop? Is it on my notebook? The answer is yes. It's all those places. I have to understand my retention time frames. Now, I'll tell you that understanding the statutory requirements is really much easier, or a much tougher task is understanding what are the true business needs and vetting that out. And then I also have to understand the conditions of my information. So you've got the onset of privacy laws that now relate to the retention of information. But depending on what industry you're in, you need to understand the characteristics of that data. So if, as an example, you're in an industry that has to comply with SEC 17A3 or A4, there are certain conditions of that information that are going to factor into not only how I retain that ESI, but how I literally have to manage it. So here's my basis. I can't do anything until I understand this. Next slide, please. So where do I get this information? I get this information from my business people. Big mistake that companies make. Can't tell you how many times I've worked with organizations where they didn't slack on resources, they spent a lot of money, but they created their retention program sort of in a vacuum. Maybe legal did it, maybe they hired an outside consultant, maybe they worked with their law firm. But you know who they didn't bring to the party, and that was the business people. And the business people are the only place you can go to understand what I just described to you. Who all's got it, why do they need it, where do they keep it at. So step one is to engage with our business people to fill out this information. Could you turn to the next page, please? So we think about our organization, we think about the structure of our organization, we think about, the areas where my information is. Another big mistake is I can't tell you how many times we've worked with an organization and they want to just focus on maybe some key areas like HR and legal. Well, folks, I'll tell you why that's a problem, because that information exists well beyond those areas. And for a seasoned litigator, an attorney like John or Ron, I think they've all got stories or experience or know that it's always those surprises they weren't expecting to find the information somewhere else in the enterprise. So you really need to approach it from an enterprise perspective. Think about your areas that you want to incorporate. Essentially what we're going to do, and you'll see at the end, is create a data map of this. And then I want to identify my business folks. Not everybody. I need a select group. I need 2 or 3, maybe as few as 1. We like to say rank and file in person, not leadership, but people that really touch this information day in and day out. Next slide, please. What you're looking at are some of the screenshots from our tool. Again, we don't have a monopoly on this process by any means, but I want to give you some illustrations of how we approach it. So what business people do understand quite well is they do understand the records they work with. They don't really understand the notion of ESI very well, but we're conditioned to think about from the time we enter into the workplace, depending on what our job is, we think about, if I'm an attorney, I think about contracts that I negotiate and drafts of contracts. If I'm in HR, I think about all my EEOC paperwork and filings. So we start there by saying, okay, let's understand what records you have and where are they across the enterprise. But here's the key. What do you do with it? Where do you save it? Do you save it out on a shared drive? Ron gave some examples of SAP. Do I go to SAP to collect information and bring it back? Maybe I modify it in some way, and then I save it. Certainly on any of my tax requirements for any of my reporting, that's all going to be comprised typically out of data that I've taken out of other systems. I have to understand this. Where is it, and what's the process that the business folks are engaged with to manage these records? Next slide, please. And hopefully you can kind of tell here, the process is a very rote process where you're just driving through. Now, I'll tell you, to create the information or to capture the information that we need, it's not a huge investment of time. We usually spend about 1 hour with each business person. But when we facilitate it through, an online web session, and when we give them a defined process, you get excellent data, and you can do it very efficiently. So I want to understand things again too, like about records. What are your retention needs? How long do you need it to do your job? When are you going to reference back to it? What's the tax considerations? What about industry standards like SEC requirements if I'm in a broker-dealer or investment advisor? What about ITAR if I'm in the defense industry? I need to also understand today, I can't stress this, I also understand, do I have any sensitivity in terms of is it personally identifiable or any government-related information? I have to understand, where are these records retained at? So is it an email? What do we do with a very important email? I know what I do. I will tend to save a copy of it, because oftentimes we work with emails getting purged after so long. So I might create a personal copy. Maybe I have that email on my iPad, my laptop, on my computer at work. And I need to understand my structured data and what's the interchange with that in terms of, am I taking data out of that to create records or not? Next slide, please. Now, when I capture all this information, then I can start to first create a set of retention rules that are really practical, that business people can work with. They're easy to understand. I've got defined triggers to understand when I can get rid of information. You'll see why that's very key here in a second. And could you go to the next slide? I'm then able to map my rules into more of a structured environment. We're big fans of SharePoint. We don't resell it. We're not an integrator. Essentially, we're technology agnostic, but it's a very good landing place, because one of the things that X1 I'm going to talk about in a little bit and show you is, okay, once I've understand where my unstructured data is, my ESI, I understand, I've segmented out what I need to keep. I need to put it somewhere. So whether it's SharePoint or some other alternative, great locations. But the point is I can then affix retention rules, and it's sort of like the old days. If anybody on the call remember this, when I had a paper document and I might have filed it in a file cabinet or sent it to a storage company, and when 3 years were up, we got rid of it. Same point here. And one last slide, and this is where I'm going to hand it over to the X1 folks. But a lot of people talk about a data map. What is a data map? Well, here's my version of what a data map is, and I'll tell you, if you don't have a good, concise data map, there's no way you can drive remediation. But the data map essentially says, here's my record type, my taxonomy. It's a description. It describes what that information is that constitutes that transaction or that record, what have you. It tells me where it is. So I've got this information in customer service in the distribution center. I need to understand that, most important, if you look over here, folks, at the far right-hand column, I have to understand where that information all sits at today. So it is an email, yes, but we also keep it on file shares, or we keep it in, or maybe I am going to an application, I'm extracting that information out. But if I can create this data map, now I can truly begin this in combination with the X1 technology, which is fantastic, to start driving remediation, reducing my exposure, my costs, and being far better prepared for when the event does occur, whether it's investigation or litigation. So at this juncture, I want to mention this too, this whole process for a large organization, small organization, it doesn't have to take 18 months, it doesn't have to take 12 months. Usually most organizations do this in 45 days or so. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to X1. John?
Thank you, Marty. So what I want to do is tie together the concepts that both Ron addressed and Marty from the legal and business process standpoint. And those are critical steps to understand and put in place. But at the end of the day, what we're talking about here is data. And data is managed by technology. And I think, as Marty alluded to, what is really needed is the ability in a systematic, automated, scalable, and defensible manner to separate the wheat from the chaff, to effectuate these processes. And this diagram here, I think, shows really at a broad, from a broad view, the workflow from a technical standpoint of what we want to accomplish. You want to first come in, perform an assessment of that data, classification of that data, to classify these records, and maybe we can classify what is relevant ESI, if there is a lawsuit pending. And then once the classification, which can be very detailed, is conducted, then we want to migrate files, set retention schedules, preserve if needed, but also purge them and remediate again in a defensible fashion. And all that enables us is to be better prepared for rediscovery, but it's a ongoing loop where it's a living process, and so that you're constantly performing these steps of assessment, classification, remediation on a routine, ongoing basis. So in order to effectuate this, what is needed is a technical solution that can fit within this workflow. And I think one of the most core requirements, and this has been a big challenge with enterprise software, whether it's e-discovery software that runs on appliances or information management enterprise search software that requires a heavy footprint, a long-term install and centralization of documents, is that really what is needed is ability to install very quickly, but not only installing quickly, but also where into these business silos, where the data resides. That is essential. As Marty mentioned, much of his work involves a 45-day assessment. So a lot of software may take 45 weeks to install. Especially we've seen enterprise search software solutions that take a long time. That certainly is not going to work. So the rapid and easy installation is essential. And then the technology should be able to perform metadata scans across all the data sources we want to interrogate. This could be dozens of file shares and servers and exchange locations, so that we can get some key metrics. What's the scope of the dates on these files? There are a lot of, we have a chart that says that these files haven't been touched in a few years or modified in a few years. What file types are we talking about? A lot of PDFs or Excel spreadsheets or other types of information that we can help get some good initial metrics around our assessment. And then we need to, and this is also very critical, be able to index in place. Again, not forcing centralization, because as Marty mentioned, we want to go into where the business environments are, and we cannot have a process that forces the entire business to change how they operate just so we can get a sense of all of their information and documents. And that's what happens when you force centralization. So we need to not only install in these silos, but index in place. We can enable search in place and review in place. And once you have that capability, a lot of outstanding options and capabilities open up in terms of being able to do detailed keyword searches or metadata filters, but also actually review these documents in place. And you can get creative by assigning out review queues to individuals, the key line of business managers and their direct reports, so that we can really do some effective and scalable classifications of documents, applying tags that become document classifications, then not only classifications, but then very operable migration paths, either to SharePoint or whatever retention repository that you'll be implementing. And then finally, when you conduct this process, what you have is a very integrated e-discovery capability. You have now a data map to not only to repositories, but to sources and classifications, so that enables very effective legal hold and remediation. So Marty talked about a typical 45-day project, and again, looking at that workflow, how X1 Discovery approaches it with our solution X1 Rapid Discovery, which is a dual e-discovery and information management solution. What we can do is, again, install very quickly into the key business silos. It can be in a central location, but it can also be in remote offices. And the key point here is that the install is very fast, and we're not forcing migration at the outset or centralization, just so that we can then manage and index these documents. We can query many data sources, most notably file share, SharePoint, Exchange, PSTs, as well as desktops. We interrogate these data sources as part of the assessment, so we can do very quick metadata scans across numerous repositories, and including the ability to at a very granular level interrogate emails and their attachments and provide very detailed reporting. And then the review process can happen. This can be done through, again, just detailed keyword searching, but we can also provide very rapid and scalable visibility into the actual data to help with the classification process. One thing that we've seen in some in other projects, where X1 is not deployed, is that you've got these great plans and processes that Jordan Lawrence have put in place, and then the actual classification and review and migration is very, very manual and can take months and sometimes years. So what we want to be able to do is to automate that process significantly, to bring that process down from years to literally days or weeks. And we can do that with, I think you'll see that John Barron will quickly provide an overview of how to do that in a very automated way, made possible by the X1 Rapid Discovery technology. And then finally, we're able to apply tags and do a very automated migration into repositories such as SharePoint, and we can also at the same time, if warranted, actually purge documents for controlled deletion. And to summarize with X1 Rapid Discovery, again, very briefly, key advantages are, again, the remote deployment, the quick deployment is essential. What we have here is very much of an enterprise class solution that can manage and search and index terabytes of data that we can install within minutes anywhere on a wide area network. And once it's installed, we point data and begin indexing. So that enables a tremendous number of use cases, and this being one of them is our tie-in to the Jordan Lawrence records information management process. But the ability to index and search in place without centralization of documents is very critical. And we have many customers that are deploying into very remote environments halfway across the world, including north of Alaska for an oil and gas firm, or the Middle East for a global engineering firm. And these are, again, we're bringing enterprise search and this capability to where the data resides, which we believe is very unique. It even deploys very effectively into the public or private cloud. We're a proud partner of Amazon Web Services. So if you have your own store of data up in Amazon or Rackspace, we can deploy into that environment, search that data without any export. And then it is also a very effective e-discovery solution, a very intuitive interface, which you will see provide a matter-centric workflow with all the e-discovery capabilities that you would expect, and strong connector support, including SharePoint. So now what I'd like to do is to introduce John Barron, Vice President here at X1 Discovery, who has a long experience previously with IBM FileNet, so really knows the information management space, and would like to provide a brief overview of, from a technical standpoint, the concepts we've discussed here.
Thank you, John. Appreciate the opportunity to present to everyone on the phone today. As John mentioned, I'm a Boston-based resource with X1. My job today, in literally the next 6 or 7 minutes, is to describe on a high level what X1 Rapid Discovery can potentially do using a human resources scenario, and speaking to the tool from a records manager or somebody on a day-to-day basis that would be reviewing information that we found inside of a given repository. What you're seeing here is X1 Rapid Discovery's main landing page. Very important to note that all of the technology that you're seeing here is 100% web-based with no plugins required down on the client. So this tool literally should and could be used throughout your enterprise wherever a web browser exists. What you're seeing here is a couple different categories of information. Down here is enterprise search. I'm going to click into the Records Manager dashboard for this particular scenario. Records Manager dashboard, you'll notice that I have effectively taken X1, the product, and pointed it to a number of human resource share locations that I have within my organization, from Chicago to Boston to Miami to Dallas. So right out of the gate, when we start using our product, we're instantly providing value to your team together with Jordan Lawrence about where this information is and, in fact, what information is out there. I'm sure from any HR perspective, you'd be surprised to note that we also found some loose PST files out there in Chicago that we might also want to analyze and look at as records. As a records manager or somebody in charge of reviewing the solution, the next screen, this search screen, would be a screen that you would see most often. If you'll allow me to describe the screen in general, I have stored searches on the left-hand side that point me to a specific work queue or things that I have already done. In the middle panel, I have a very metadata-centric view of all of the documents that I was able to scan out there in my human resources shared world. On the right-hand side of the panel, we have a full fidelity preview supporting 500 different document formats, as well as hit highlighting. For this particular scenario, I am going to focus on a given area inside of the data set. My scenario exists, I'm going to focus on HR in Chicago, and I am going to go to my review queue. My review queue instantly brings me back all of the documents, if you will, that X1 Rapid Discovery was able to uncover when pointing at that given share. I want to point out to you that the process that we're going to take. We are going to review the documents. We are going to classify those documents and put them either into our Migrate to EDRM queue, which you now see is empty, or into my Remediate queue, which you now notice is empty. If I go back to my review queue, I'm very quickly going to just quickly show you some capabilities. I'm going to go into my View tab. I'm going to go into and I'm going to toggle those table filters. I know for a fact, as a very simple scenario, that anything that is before 2006 is something I first of all want to uncover. We have, if you notice down here, over 1,000 documents in this share that are older than 2006, our standard retention period. What I'd like to do for all of these documents en masse is to click the Remediate button. What I've effectively done is to tag all of these documents that are older than 2006. I have now tagged them for remediation. What I'd also like to demonstrate is our ability to look inside of the information that we have found. So I'm just going to quickly click search here on my review queue. And what you'll notice is I have a number of PST files, emails if you will. In my scenario, we've uncovered an employee that works in benefits by the name of Lisa Gang. So I am very quickly going to isolate my search to that directory and her PST. Now what's important about Lisa is that we know, having her worked in benefits, we know that any document from 2010 is going to be declared as a record. So very simply what I've done is I've classified, it could be up to millions of documents, but in this case thousands of documents, as emails, and now I'm going to classify them as a record. I'm going to classify them as an HR benefits record, if you will. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to tag all of those documents en masse as an HR benefit record. Going back to just finishing up the overall demonstration scenario now, what I have done is I have looked into thousands of records that existed into the Chicago HR shared location. I have categorized those documents, a number of those documents, for remediation. As you notice here inside of my remediation queue, all of those documents are tagged remediation, as well as I have tagged a queue where all of those documents that need to be migrated into our EDRM repository. In either case, we have the ability to take that result set and create what we call a deliverable, a defensible, forensically sound export, as well as a controlled value list listing where those documents are for the purposes of either ingestion into the downstream EDRM application like SharePoint, or to be remediated and destroyed. In general now, I have the ability to also classify. Now you'll notice I've completed all my work and my review queue is completed. I might also have a certain classification of documents that are completely user-definable that I classify for additional review, and I have the ability, of course, to share these stored searches with any individual inside of my organization that simply has an access to a web browser. I'll stop here as far as my demonstration is concerned. What we've tried to show you is our ability to look inside of a number of network file shares that exist outside in your organization, to be able to very quickly classify what exists inside of that shared location, and then classify those documents as either records, in this case HR benefit records, or classify them very quickly for remediation. Thank you very much in advance. Thank you very much for the time on the phone today. The short period of time that I've been given just for this quick little demonstration is hopefully gives you a taste of what we can do for your organization. John, I'm passing it back to you.
Thank you, John. So I think that what we've seen here has been really coming from all three angles: legal, and the excellent presentation from Ron, the business processes from Jordan Lawrence, who's been in this business for over 2 decades and have done literally thousands of these engagements with really the top Fortune 1000 firms and other key firms as well. I think Marty really drove home the best practices for these business processes, and what X1 Discovery I think has set out to accomplish is to tie those together with, again, where the rubber hits the road, and that is technical effectuation. One kind of annotation I would give to John Barron's presentation is that the software you saw was actually installed in Amazon. Data is located in Amazon, and that's important because it demonstrates that if the technology can install in Amazon, it can also very easily and quickly install within your enterprise, again, where the data resides. Again, thank John for his demonstration. Want to again thank, before we get to questions, again thank our speakers and all the attendees, and also Jordan Lawrence for co-sponsoring. Let me turn it over to Catherine now for Q&A.
Sure, great, thanks. So we'll now open up the lines to our attendees to pose questions to our speakers. And as I mentioned at the beginning of the broadcast, you have 2 options to ask a question. You may raise your hand by clicking on the yellow colored hand in your control panel, and we will unmute your phone line to pose your question directly to the speakers, or you may enter your question in the chat window at the bottom of the control panel. Let's just take a look here. We have a question that's been posed here. Let me just, can you do keyword search in PDF docs? I believe that's to John Pasakis.
John Barron can answer that question.
Okay.
Yes, I'm happy to do that. Just in the brief time that we had for demonstration, we really didn't cover the comprehensiveness of the search solution. The solution that I showed you is well suited to both e-discovery and records management activity. The full text searching of PDF is something that we have capabilities to do, as well as some unique capabilities for hit highlighting, proximity searching both within sentence as well as paragraph structure. So hopefully that answers that question.
Great, thank you. Ron, did you have anything you wanted to add?
Yeah, now that we've seen the presentation, as my property professor said, it's always easier to understand the concepts once you've already had the class. What I wanted to highlight was, the strategy that I laid out seems pretty simple and basic, but especially for people that haven't been around the industry that long, what I don't think they would have realized is the game-changing nature of the capabilities that this X1 Discovery tool brings. I mean, you literally couldn't do it before. And to the extent that you could do it, it required a major effort with forensically trained consultants using, as John said, stuff that took maybe 90 days to install, where you had live agents all over the network. And that's exactly what we did, which is why I knew how expensive it was and how long it takes. Now, anyone who's really trained in any kind of litigation, whether they don't need to be an attorney, can go out there and use this tool, which is very intuitive, document the process, and go out and do what we used to do in the days before electricity, which is go to all the custodians and say, put it all in a box. Now you can go out there and sweep all those different file types, look at them, and make sure you've kept the one that you had. And that's really, that tool is what enables the business process, and it literally didn't exist until now.
Great. Thanks, Ron. I'm going to go ahead and read the next question here. Can you explain how rapid discovery plugs into the network share? John Barron, you want to answer that?
Yes, of course, I'm happy to. One of the benefits of X1 Discovery is that we can install very quickly in very low-end hardware. So most typically we find that we want to deploy X1 either in a Windows-based server or in a virtual world out in that field location. Once we do that, X1 Rapid Discovery has a number of connectors that we support, such as SharePoint, such as a PST, but we also have a file-based connector, of course. That file-based connector allows us to point to file shares, index 500-plus file formats, as well as pick up the security and access control list associated with that document. That's all metadata that we use to filter out relevant records, and also metadata that we can use in the migration process to the EDRMS system. Great question, thank you.
Okay, we've got another question here. Can X1 be installed on a copier or scanner?
I guess that's mine by default. The answer to that question would be no. We would point to the directory where that copier or scanner produced that information. Sorry, John.
And John, maybe kind of a follow-up question, if I might add, is that maybe, especially the enterprise copier scanners, have an associated file server where the output goes to, which may be a way to support the copy process. So that's all, so the actual copier scanner, no, but if there's an associated file server where the documents go to before they're scanned or after, we would be able to support that process as well.
Okay, so next question here, we've got any advanced searching capabilities such as find similar or find duplicates, near duplicates, or is it limited to Boolean searching?
Yes, the answer is yes, not limited at all to just Boolean searching. One of the screenshots that you might have seen that went by very quickly is our ability to identify duplicates inside of the data set, remove those duplicates from the review process, and also remove those duplicates from the downstream ingestion or into other systems. Of course, we would include the duplicates in any sort of remediation.
Okay. All right, great, everybody. Thanks for everyone's time. We're now at the top of the hour. We're going to end the Q&A session. The recording of today's webinar, along with the PDF of the slides, will be emailed to all the attendees within 5 business days. Up here, we've got all the contact information for our speakers. And for any further inquiries, please visit x1discovery.com. Thanks again and have a great day.